All right, well, we're going to jump right into our study in the book of Revelation. We're going to be in Revelation chapter 13 tonight, if you'd like to turn there with me. Revelation 13. And just to give another recap, we've been working through the trumpet judgments, right? These are the trumpet judgments of God's wrath that He is having unfold on the earth. And we saw that we got all the way up to the sixth trumpet at the end of chapter 9, where in chapter 10 we think we're right about to get to the final trumpet and everything's going to be done with the book, but then we get this interlude in chapter 10, where there's this great mighty angel that comes down from heaven and gives John a little book that he is to eat. And we talked about how this book was bittersweet when he ingested it, and there's some symbolism of what that means, pointing to Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel. And then we saw after he had taken this book in chapter 11, we see probably one of the hardest chapters in all of the Bible to understand and to interpret, where we see this, the ministry of the two witnesses. We see the measuring of the temple, and we see these two witnesses that come on the scene that have these abilities, these super natural powers to do certain things that point back to Elijah and Moses. And as I said, there's some speculation on whether these were individuals that existed in AD 70, whether these are two individuals that will come in the future, whether these represent the church. There's a variety of views on that. But there is this description in chapter 11 where at the end of their ministry, which is for a certain amount of time, it's 1,260 days, which is the same number that we will see again and again throughout this book. Once that time period has ended, it says that there's this beast that comes, and the beast kills the two witnesses. And then the witnesses, they rise from the dead, they ascend to heaven, and then from there we see that there's this earthquake that occurs. So we saw all of that happening, and then the end of chapter 11, we jump back into the narrative of the trumpet judgments, where we see finally the seventh trumpet. And verses 15 to 19, it describes how the kingdoms of this world are becoming the kingdom of God, and how Christ's return is imminent. And so then we think we're finishing, the whole book should finish basically right there, you would think. And then we get another interlude. Just like in chapter 10, there was a break in the narrative. Well, in chapter 12, we started another interlude. And last week we saw in chapter 12, there's this description of the woman, and there is this dragon that is pursuing this woman. And the woman is described as being pregnant and having these birth pains, and this dragon is seeking to devour the child. And then this child is born, and the child is described as being a great ruler who comes to earth and then immediately ascends and goes to the throne of God. And we talked last week on how that child is Jesus Christ, and how in verse 9 of chapter 12, it clearly identifies the dragon as Satan. So we see that Satan has been pursuing and wanting to kill the woman's seed, who is Jesus Christ. And then we talked a little bit about who the woman represents, and there's a couple of different views. I think the prominent major view is that it's going to describe the woman as being Israel, or faithful Israel, and how Israel brought forth the Messiah, and then the devil has been pursuing the Messiah throughout this whole span of history. So we see this description, and we see how there is the child ascends to heaven, and then it describes Satan, the dragon, going to heaven, and there's this war described in heaven where Satan wars with Michael, and there's this battle between angels going on, and then the dragon loses, is cast down to the earth, and so he goes to pursue the woman again, and the woman is protected or preserved, and so he's angry because now he knows he only has a short amount of time left on the earth to pursue. And so what he does is he turns his attention to the other offspring of the woman, and it describes those individuals as those who have kept the word of God and are living and obeying his commandments. So we see these are the saints that the dragon is going to pursue. He's pursuing those who are faithful to God. Well, with all that being said, we're going to be moving then into chapter 13, where we're going to be looking at two new characters that are going to be undeveloped or developed for us, where we're going to see the beast from the sea, in verses 1 to 10, and we're going to see the beast from the earth in verses 11 to 18. So let us read this together, and then we'll unpack it. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. And I saw on one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with a sword must be killed with a sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he declares those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive the mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark of the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. So we got a fun chapter this evening, looking at these 2 different beasts. As we already said, we have the beast from the sea, and we have the beast from the earth. So we'll take one beast at a time here, and we'll go a little bit and just see what the text describes about it, and what is the significance of what they are describing. And then after we go and unpack the text a little bit, I'll share with you the 3 interpretations of what is being presented here, and then we'll move to the second beast. So in the first section, in verse 1, we see that it describes how there is this beast that is rising up out of the sea, and it has 7 heads and 10 horns. And if you notice in the beginning, in verse 1, it says, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea." Some who might not have the New King James or the King James Version, yours might say something different. It might say, "He," or "the dragon stood on the sand of the sea." If you see that, and you might be wondering, well, why does it say that? Because one is saying it's the dragon, and one is saying it's John. That's based upon the manuscripts that they use to discern and translate the text. So as some of you may know, there are different traditions between the New King James tradition and some of the earlier manuscripts. So I think that it might potentially be better understood as it describing the dragon as being the one on the sand, because it seems that the dragon is the one that is summoning these beasts from the sea and the earth. But regardless of which way you prefer it, we see that John is witnessing this, whether he is the one that is standing on the sand or whether it's the dragon. But we see that this is by the power of Satan and the authority of Satan, that the dragon, that we see that there's this beast from the sea that is rising up, and he has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, if you remember how the dragon was described in chapter 12, that is exactly how he was described, as having 7 heads and 10 horns. So we see that there's clearly a connection between the first beast and Satan, and how it even goes on to say that this beast is given his power and authority because of Satan. So we see that the devil is clearly at work with this individual. He comes out of the sea, which some take that to describe that maybe this is an individual that is coming out of the sea of humanity, or he is going to have a Gentile origin. Sometimes that the Jews would understand that the sea would be symbolic for Gentile nations. And as this time period of persecution is known as the time of the Gentiles, this makes some think that this individual that will rise up at some time in history, whether it's in the past, present, or future, that this will be a non-Jew, potentially. Others think that it might just be describing it to point from the fact that it's coming from a dark, dangerous, chaotic place, because the sea also could be known for its danger. So there's some dark, eluding force that is coming out, rising up in verse 1. However, it goes on to describe in verse 2 a little bit more of the characteristics of this beast. We see not only does he have 7 heads and does he have 10 horns, but then it says that he has the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And so what we hear here is some odd descriptions of some animal mashups. But if you know much about the book of Daniel, we see something very similar language here. And I think what John is doing is he's actually alluding to the vision of the 4 beasts in Daniel chapter 7. So I'm going to turn there. I'm going to read some of this for us, because I think this is going to really be helpful for us understanding what this beast represents and who this beast really is. So if you'd like to kind of keep marked Revelation 13, and I'm also going to read a decent amount of Daniel 7 for us. And as I said, Daniel 7, we're going to see in verses 1 to 8 the vision of the 4 beasts, and then in verses 15 to 27, we're going to see how the vision is interpreted by one of the angels that Daniel asked, because he doesn't understand what he just saw in his vision. So he asks an angel, and the angel describes what he basically just saw. So I'll read this for us, and then we'll go from there. So Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 to 8, and then I'm going to jump to verse 15. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made to stand on the 2 feet like a man. And a man's heart was given to it. And suddenly another beast, a second like a bear, it was raised up on one side, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Skip into verse 15. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near to one of those who stood by, and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. So those great beasts, which are four kings, which arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that the horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints, and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High. And the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Thus he said, the fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings, who shall arise from this kingdom. And another shall rise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. I know that's a lot of reading, but that's why we call this Bible study, right? All right, so what we see in this, you're going to notice a lot of parallels, if you haven't already, from Revelation 13. First, you're going to see how there are beasts that are being described like the beast in Revelation 13. But there are 4 beasts in Daniel's vision. And it describes them as the first one is a lion, the second one is a bear, the third one is a leopard, and then the fourth one is a 10-horned beast. Whereas in Revelation 13, we see that there is this beast that has 7 heads, and he has all of the characteristics of the 3 other animals, right? The leopard, the lion, the bear. He has all of those, but he also is he is the beast with the 10 horns. And so how does the angel interpret this to Daniel? Well, what he says is, he says the 4 beasts that are in Daniel, they actually represent 4 different kingdoms, or 4 successive empires that will control these groups of people moving forward in history. And if you look to Daniel chapter 2, we would know what these different empires are. This is describing the lion as Babylon, which was the current reign that Daniel was under with Nebuchadnezzar. Then we have the bear, which represents Medo-Persia, which is the kingdom that took over and conquered Babylon. Then we have the leopard, which represents Greece, which came and took over Medo-Persia. And then finally, the 10-horned beast represents the empire of Rome, which comes and conquers Greece. So when we think about, because Babylon, the symbols commonly known for Babylon were the lion, or I believe it was the eagle. And it goes on to describe this first beast in Daniel 7 as being one who is like a wild man, but then he starts to be able to get up on his hind legs and get his sanity and a heart for humanity. That describes the condition of, if you remember what happened with Nebuchadnezzar, where he had his power, he kind of went insane, and then God worked and did some things in his life. And then we go to the bear, and it has these 3 ribs in his mouth. And most scholars take the 3 ribs to describe the 3 different empires that Medo-Persia actually controlled and took over, because they took over 3 different groups in that time period as they are coming and conquering Babylon. The leopard, many think, describes the fact that as a leopard is quick, so was this attack and conquering of Medo-Persia, led by, as some of you guys know, maybe history. This time period whenever Medo-Persia was taken over was by Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great was conquering and he was moving so swiftly in such a short amount of time that no one has ever seen it before, we see that he conquered very quickly. But whenever he died, he didn't have an heir. And so his groups were actually spread out into 4 different subgroups of kingdoms that then were taken over by Rome. And as we all know, Rome became the epicenter. It became the kingdom, the empire. It was greater. It was unlike any others. So we see then that what Daniel was seeing is how there's going to be a line of these different kingdoms and different rulers that are going to take over, and their viciousness is going to change and be different types of characteristics. But the final one, which is the 10-horned beast, is the one that concerned him the most. And we see in Daniel 7, verses 24 to 25, that the 10 horns represent 10 kings. So within this 4th beast, right? So the 4th beast, which we see is Rome, there's going to be 10 kings that reign within Rome. And so when people are looking and trying to understand this, we have to either think this is either going to be describing Rome in the past, where there was 10 kings, or this is going to be describing Rome in the future, where there will be, at some point, a plurality of leadership of 10 kings. But there's going to be this empire of Rome at some point in history with these 10 kings. But then in Daniel 7, it goes on to say, and there's this little horn that isn't like the other kings, like the other horns, right? The horns represent kings. There's this little horn that starts out small, but it actually ends up to overpower and take control of all the other horns. So that's pointing to there's going to be some type of king or some type of ruler that's going to take over and basically rule the major 10 kingdoms, or the 10 kings that conquer over the empire of Rome. So how then, as we go back to Revelation 13, how do we think about this? Well, I think what John is seeing in Revelation 13 is this 4th beast. He is seeing the same beast that was promised in Daniel. So we see then that Babylon has passed, Medo-Persia has passed, Greece has passed, and now where John is currently at in history, Rome is, it's the power. It's persecuting the Christians. It's persecuting the church. And that's regardless of your view of the book of Revelation. We'll go a little bit more in detail, but there could be either, this could be Nero, or this could be a little bit later with Domitian. But either way, Rome was persecuting the saints at this time. And so those who are reading this and hearing this, they would recognize that John is alluding to Rome in some sense. But then he goes on to say in verse 3 that this beast had a head that appeared to be mortally wounded and then healed. So this is describing that there's this kingdom, there's this beast that has these kings, and within one of these leaders, or somehow within this ruler, this reign, there seems to be what it looks like it's a death, where it seems to be apparently a mortal wound to the beast. But then it says, but this beast didn't stay dead. It was healed, and because it was healed, it started to gain all of this worship. So people start to basically see this beast, thought it was dead. It rose up, it's powerful, has authority from Satan, and now basically all the nations are starting to worship this beast. And with the worship that the beast has, he then uses it to go into war against the saints for 42 months, it says. So in verses 4 to 8, it describes how once this beast came on the scene, there was some type of incident where it seems like it was gone, and that he was here, he lives, and then he gets all of this worship, and then he wars against the saints, which is very similar to what the little horn does. The little horn that grew started to war against the saints. And it describes the little horn's rule as being over the entire earth. So it's describing a universal rule that isn't like what Rome actually has in history. So if you were to take this literally, you would think, well, this seems to be Rome that might be a revived Roman Empire in the future, where there will be a universal reign at some point of a dictator leader. Or some will say this might be hyperbole, talking about Rome in AD 70 was very powerful and it was like it. So you just going to have to take that and kind of work through how you understand that. But it seems to describe a universal reign of this beast that has come and is starting to war against the saints. And as I said, it's for 42 months. And if you remember in Daniel 7, I said it earlier, it says that the little horn's reign was for how long? Does anyone remember? Well, technically, yes. So really, if you say any of these time periods, you'll be right. But it described it as a time, times, and half a time, right? Which we talked about that before. A time is 1 year, times 2 years, and half a time is half a year. So 1 plus 2, 3 and half. So 3.5 years is the time period of this individual's reign. 42 months is the same amount of time. Or if we've already seen earlier, it describes 1,260 days. All of that is describing the same period of time here where this beast is given authority. So we see the clear connection between the little horn and the beast of Revelation 13. They have the same period of time. They're gaining this worship. They are a part of this beast, this rule that has the 10 horns, the 10 kings, and this one will come and rise to power, have this great amount of authority, and will start to kill and persecute the saints. So we have a lot of Old Testament that we had to unpack there to kind of see all what John is talking about. Because when he's unpacking a lot of this, it's to a lot of Jews that would understand and already have Daniel as their background knowledge. So we see that he starts to war against the church, the saints. So how do we understand this for our interpretations, right? Let's see here. We have it up here. So I have this on the screen for you guys. I'll leave this up here for the rest of the study. So there are basically the three ways to fully understand the book of Revelation. Usually, you'll take one of these perspectives, and that's how you'll understand as we're working through the book. So the idealist, that is going to be the individual who is basically to say that what we're seeing through the book of Revelation, we see all these prophecies. These are things that are going to be fulfilled throughout history. So we're not looking for there's this beast that came here in 2021 in America on this day, right? They're not looking for that specifically. Rather, they're saying that this is going to be a cycle of things happening throughout history, and a lot of what we're seeing is symbolic. So it's not meant to be taken physical, literal, every single step of the way. So an idealist is going to take this text, and they're going to have some symbolic or spiritual understanding of it. So how does an idealist understand the beast from the sea? Well, the idealist would say that they view the first beast to represent the persecuting power of Satan operating through the nations of this world and their governments. So as we look through time, right, as we think about Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, as we think about what's going on in Afghanistan right now, when we think about all of these different things, and we think about all of this wickedness, and we see these governments and these authorities and these military forces that war against Christians, that seek to cause chaos, to promote sin, what the idealist would say is all of these governments, all of these powers throughout history, that is the beast. The beast that is coming all the way throughout history. We see it time and time again in all of these civil governments that control the world. So whenever the idealist looks at this text, they're saying that the beast that John is seeing is all of these corrupt, wicked governments that are inspired and empowered by Satan. So that's how an idealist would take this. So then we have the preterist. The preterist believes that these prophecies that we're going to find in Revelation are almost all fulfilled in the past. So what we're looking at in chapter 13 is not something that's happening, in a couple years or in 100 years. They'd say that most of this happened right around the time of AD 70, right? So AD 70, that's when Jerusalem was attacked by Rome. That's when the temple was destroyed, right? That's where Christianity and Judaism was separated. We had all of these different Christians and Jews fleeing because of all of this war and destruction. So the preterist, when they look to this beast from the sea, they would say that this beast probably represents either Nero Caesar, who persecuted and killed many of the Christians, and or Rome. And as you notice, as I was describing the beast, how there's kind of this overlap between it's the empire, it's the kingdoms, but it's also the king, right? Or it's also the ruler. There's kind of this blending of the horns and the beast and the head, so it's not really clear on what exactly aspect are they fully emphasizing. And so the preterist would say that this isn't meant to be separated between Nero and Rome. Rather, they're kind of all described within the beast. So when we think about Rome attacking Jerusalem, when we think about Nero persecuting the Christians, this is that beast in Revelation 13. And so when we see the wound that happens to the beast, right, it seems like that the beast had died, but he's healed. What the preterist would say is this most likely points to the fact that Nero, whenever he committed suicide, right, after he had terrorized and caused the fires and all that had happened, he committed suicide, and so that would be the wound, but the Roman Empire continued on. And actually it was stabilized by Vespasian. And so the fact that Rome had Nero being this beast leading it, he died, they thought Rome would maybe be conquered, but instead it was stabilized by this other individual. So they would say that is how the beast was hindered or injured, but then lives on through Rome. And so that's what the preterists would say. So it's this, what happened in AD 70 with the events of Nero and the destruction of Jerusalem. The futurist is going to view this the most literally. They're going to say that this is a future event that has not happened yet. And they would say that the beast from the sea is meant to be understood as the eschatological Antichrist. So you've heard the Antichrist. This is the Antichrist that will come one day, and he will be the world dictator. So if you've ever thought of, the intelligence of one of the smartest people one of the greatest leaders, it's like a Hitler on steroids in that sense, that he's going to just wage war on righteous people. He's going to create mass genocide. He's going to have all of this power. He's going to do all of these things. And that's basically how the futurist is going to take it. And they would say that the beast from the sea that's one way of understanding him, or the Antichrist. They would say the man of lawlessness, if you're aware of that title in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, that Paul talks about there's this man of sin, or the man of lawlessness that will come with the apostasy, and he will have war on the saints until Christ's return. And also the little horn of Daniel 7. They're saying this little horn that is prophesied has not come yet. There have maybe been shadows, but eventually there will be this revival of the Roman Empire that will come with this nation of 10 kings that will be in this empire, and there will be this one individual that will end up going above all of the kings and become the world dictator. So when we hear those titles for the Antichrist, the beast from the sea, the man of lawlessness, the little horn, the futurists would say all of those are the same individual, and that is a future individual that will come later. So that is what we see then for the idealist, the preterist, and the future. One last thing I'll say about the futurist, when they understand the wound. So the idealist would say that this is more about how governments, could fall and grow and come back, right? Because they're not looking for a specific individual. The preterist would say that it was Vespasian that came and solidified Rome, allowed it to stay stable. Well, the futurist is going to say that the mortal wound is either an actual mortal wound that kills the person, and he actually rises from the dead. So it's like if you saw one of the world powers on the stage today, he gets assassinated or shot, and then a day or two later, he's up again, and he's talking and he's ruling. That's one potential. Another is thinking that maybe it appears as if he was killed, and then he comes back on the scene. So maybe it's either that he literally died and rose from the dead, which is to mimic what the two witnesses did and also point to back what Jesus did, the gospel, right? That he died and rose. So it could be that there's just trying to have a parody of the gospel. Or it could be that they don't have the ability to bring life from the dead, and maybe it's a fake. It's all trying to trick people into worship. Because as we see, because of this event, the world starts to worship this beast. So this is a beast that is very popular with the world. So that's what we see from the beast of the sea. Now, the beast of the earth is going to be a little bit easier to unpack. So not as much of Old Testament background that we're going to have to read and unpack. So in verse 11, we see that this beast from the earth comes up. And as I noted earlier, if the sea is meant to distinguish between the earth and the sea as not only just distinguishing the two beasts, but also saying of their origin. If the sea is about Gentiles, then the earth may represent Israel or Jerusalem. So therefore, this individual, if that is what is meant by the sea and the earth, this individual could be a Jew that is coming on the scene. But if it's not meant to describe Gentile and Jew, it could just meant to distinguish between the two. However, that's just some food for you to think about. But he comes out of the earth, and then it describes him in verse 11 as having the appearance of a lamb. He has two horns like a lamb, but it says he speaks or has the voice of a dragon. So if we already remember back to Revelation chapter 5, who is the lamb? Jesus, right? The lamb comes, takes the scroll. The Lamb of God is the one we worship. This individual comes on the scene, appears like a lamb, very kind, charismatic, helpful. Maybe has some, if he's a Jew, maybe he has a lot of Jewish history, knows a lot of the Old Testament and the Scriptures. Maybe it's a very good religious man or person. But then it says, but the voice that comes out of this lamb is a dragon, which points it back to the authority that is coming from Satan. So the same power that was given to the beast is given to this individual. And as we'll see later in the book, this individual, the second beast, is also titled as the false prophet. So you've heard of maybe the Antichrist. This is the false prophet that is being described here. And so when it says he has the voice of a dragon, that means that he is promoting and teaching false doctrine, and he is actually going to be deceiving people away from the truth of who God is. And that's actually what we see for the rest of this chapter, specifically in verses 12 to 15, where it talks about how he starts to cause the earth to worship the first beast. That's basically his mission. He's kind of like the minion of the first beast. So his goal is basically to start, it says that he has all of these powers that he can bring fire down from heaven, which is what the two witnesses did, right? So we see a little bit of parody again with this beast. So we see they can bring fire down, but also it describes how it made or had this image of the beast or a statue or something that is created to picture the first beast. And then the second beast from the earth is able to breathe and give life, to where this image somehow is showing that it's alive. So it would seem that maybe this false prophet might have the ability to make inanimate objects appear to be living. So we see that this second beast has some supernatural powers that is going to be meant to cause and to motivate and manipulate people to trust and to follow the beast. However, it goes on to describe that there are going to be those who are in the Lamb's Book of Life, that is the saints, those who trust in Jesus. There will be those who aren't going to worship the beast. They're not going to worship this image, and they're not going to buy in to all of these supernatural acts, these signs. So what happens then is he starts to try to coerce them through force, and it starts to have the image starts to kill some of the saints. And then we see that there's even this force of this famous number that I'm sure all of us have heard about, and sometimes there's even like a superstition with it, the mark of the beast, which is 666. And this is what is being implanted on the hands and the foreheads of those who worship and follow the beast. So therefore, anyone that doesn't have the mark, the beast will go and war against and persecute and will seek to kill. So what is the mark of the beast? What is 666? I will tell you right now, it is not the vaccine. I have heard and seen so many posts saying, don't get the vaccine because it's the vaccine. It's the mark of the beast. It's a microchip that they're putting in you so they can track you. This is not what is being described in Revelation 13. All right, it is not what is being described. John is not seeing that, because those who get this are those who are worshiping the beast. So what potentially could it be? Well, it could be that there was actually some type of, or will be some type of tattoo or some type of ID that this person may have. But it could also be that it's a spiritual symbolic thing. Because if you remember earlier, we had the sealing of the 144,000 by God.
And in that sealing, I don't think any of us thought that all of them started getting these tattoos that says, "I'm God's," on their forehead. But it says that it was on their foreheads just earlier in the same book. So it's very possible that it might just be more your life and how you pronounce yourself and who you are claiming to be a part of, which team. However, it could be that there was, like I said, some type of actual mark that either will be enforced or has been enforced in the past. But the number is significant because it says it's 666, and that there's some type of wisdom with being able to discern that number. Well, there have been tons of different scholars that have come to try to decipher and understand, and they have come up with tons of different answers to who 666 stands for. It's gone from Nero all the way up to Barack Obama. I mean, we've had it all over the place of who this 666 is supposed to represent. I will say that there is some more weight to Nero Caesar than there is to a Barack Obama on its description. There's something known within the Jewish system of their lettering where there would be value for numbers with their letters. So Nero Caesar in the Hebrew actually would have equaled up to 666, which is interesting. And a preterist is going to jump on that very quickly and say, therefore, Nero is the Antichrist. And I think that that's actually a pretty strong argument for that specific verse and that focus right there. However, I think that an idealist or a futurist could point out and say, maybe even if this is describing Nero, he could be a type or a shadow of what is to come. Right? An idealist would say that all day long. The idealist is saying, yeah, you're seeing it all the way through history, so you should expect to see it in Nero and whoever else you see in the future. But a futurist could also say, likewise, that there are things that were shadows of the past, and how AD 70 is a type of the day of the Lord that is to come in the future. One other thing I will say about the 666 that I think can be agreed upon for all different interpretations is the number 6 is just shy of the number 7. And as we've already been going through this book, we see how the number 7 is a number of God. It's a number of perfection or completeness. And in Genesis, we know that man was created on the 6th day. So it could be, because it even says this is the number of man, that what is being described as 666 is just saying this is a man who is not God. This is a man who is not perfect. This is a man not to be worshipped, and anything that comes from this man is man and not divine. So therefore, we should not worship this individual because he is not of God. And I think that really is the fundamental thing for us understanding that. Whether that number has already happened, whether there's something in the future that we need to be concerned about, ultimately it's going to be our understanding in relationship to Jesus Christ that matters. Not about a scary vaccine or some type of tattoo in the future. What we need to be focused on is our relationship to Jesus. So that kind of leads me then, I'll share with you the interpretations of this, and then I'll share with you my few application points for this evening. So the idealist, they view the second beast to represent the false religions and philosophies that we see throughout the world, throughout time. So whenever you see these different religions that grow up through cults, through different groups, when we think about all the different philosophies that say that sin is okay, that you can do these different things, that God is not the true God, all of these religions and philosophies, they are all the second beast, who is pointing us to a false God, to an idol, to a false sense of worship. And the purpose that they have are to deceive us, to manipulate, and to force us into embracing the doctrines of demons. So an idealist would say the false prophet is the one that we've seen throughout history. All of these different governments come with a different ideology or a different religion system. So all of this is pointing us to going towards the demons and not towards the divine. The preterist will say that this is either describing the pagan religious systems that supported the imperial power of Rome in AD 70, so there's different religious groups that were pagan that were promoting them, or apostate Israel, so the Jews of that time that rejected Jesus and that they actually started to work and to worship and live under the authority of the beast. So the preterist would say that this is some type of religious either group or some religious leaders of the time that were promoting the Antichrist, were promoting Nero in Rome at that specific time. And finally, the futurists would say that this is a future false prophet that Jesus warned about, where he says that there will be false Christs and false prophets that will come to deceive, if possible, even the elect, in his Sermon on the Mount, on his Olivet Discourse. And this is that future false prophet that was promised to come and will be the consummation before the end of the world. And he will seek and succeed in deceiving majority of the world, leading them to the Antichrist. And this individual will actually be given these supernatural abilities to deceive the nations. So, what are some applications that we can take away from this chapter? Well, the first one is, I think, that Christians must be reminded to test the spirits. In all things, we are to test. So what that means is, even though there might be things that look good, looks can be deceiving. As we saw in this text, it talks about how, in Daniel, there's this little horn. He doesn't seem to be much at first, but he ends up becoming the main threat. When we think about the second beast, he has the appearance of a lamb. He looks very like Jesus. He seems to be very nice, right? So this guy might be, or this person might be very nice or kind or easy to get along with. But what really is happening is the voices of a dragon, the power and the authority of the dragon. So we need to recognize that we could be deceived if we aren't being discerning. That we need to recognize that even if there are supernatural, miraculous gifts, like if there's someone that comes later and starts being able to call down fire and can bring life to things, or can act like they died and rose from the dead, we are to be discerning and recognize that that is not Jesus. Because Scripture's already warned us in saying that is what we should expect from the enemy. So looks can be deceiving. Satan will deceive many with miraculous signs, but we are called to test all things. The other application is that Satan, as we see in this text, is a counterfeit of the faithful and true God. When we compare Satan to God, it's no comparison. See, we see God, the holy, perfect, divine Trinity. We think of the Father, right? The one on the throne. We think of his Son, who came and died on the cross for our sins, rose from the dead. And we think about the Holy Spirit, who now lives within us and transforms our hearts and our lives so that we can know God and love him and worship him forever. Well, in this chapter, we see that Satan makes a mockery or a parody of the Trinity. We see the unholy Trinity here. We see the dragon, we see the beast from the sea, the Antichrist, and we see the beast from the earth, the false prophet. So right here we see a counterfeit of the true God. We see the unholy Trinity. We also see a false resurrection. We see that there's this beast that starts to get worshipped because of the apparent mortal wound and that he was healed. Likewise, Jesus died and rose from the dead. But our salvation comes from the gospel of Christ's death and resurrection, where this is solely meant to gain worship and attention. It has no benefit, no salvation, no life given to anyone other than praise for Satan. So it's completely selfish, a selfish resurrection. And then the final thing that we see parodied in this chapter is the mark of the beast, which is talking about those who follow the beast and are all going to be killed and destroyed and used by the beast, whereas those who are sealed by God are to be protected and preserved forever. So we see the different parodies. We see the Trinity, the resurrection, and the marks all being parodied as a counterfeit by Satan, which reminds us that our God is true and faithful, and he is the one we should be desiring and seeking after. I think we also see a warning here that there is no room for neutral ground as Christians. There is either a time in the past, there is a time for us now in the present, or a time in the future where there will not be any third option here. You will either choose to worship the beast or you will choose to worship the Lamb. And I think that for all of us, we need to recognize that there is no neutral ground for us. We are either advocating for the beast in our life right now, or we are advocating for Christ. With our lives, with our thoughts, with our actions, we need to think, whose side are we on? Who are we giving our worship to? And the final application for this evening is that though there is power and authority given to the kingdoms of darkness, we need to remember that all of their power and authority is contingent on God's sovereign allowance. Every single time we see that there's this persecution or this authority given to these individuals, it says, but they have a short time, or their time is allotted for 42 months, or times, and half a time. The point of that is saying it is temporary. No matter how many kingdoms, rulers, wickedness we see in this world, we understand the kingdom of God is forever. And so these things will be passing. Persecution is temporary, and we can endure and we can trust in the Lord because his kingdom will come, Christ will come, and it will be forever.